Gavelin, this work session on two ordinances, AO 2019-7 and 10. It is 1:05 on Friday, January 25th. Members present are Mr. Training.
Duke Training.
Pete Peterson.
Gretchen Wembley.
Austin Davidson.
Me, Eric Croft.
Bill Falsey, Municipal Manager.
Dyson.
Slivka and Dyson talked over each other, but they're both here.
Chris.
Dean Gates, and then we have Chris on the phone. And hello, great, he's there. And Weddleton on the phone, great. Anyone else on the phone?
I can.
And then Mr. Dunbar is in National Guard duty and asked to be excused. We'll reflect that. Mr. Rivera, I'm coming to it. Mr. Rivera was unable to be here and asked to be excused. We'll reflect that. And then Ms. LaFrance just came in. Hi, Ms. LaFrance.
Hi, Mr. Krause.
So we have more than a quorum, and we have Mr. Falsey, the city manager, who is, as we all know, a PowerPoint extraordinaire and is going to present on the first one, which is the junk car ordinance, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep.
Someone wants to grab the light so it'll make the feast for the eyes even more delicious. We have two ordinances today, both of which are intended to ripen into propositions to go to voters in April. I've got the first. Becky McPherson, our municipal attorney, has the second. First is AO 2019 number 7, a ballot proposition to amend the charter to let us delegate enforcement of ordinances related to abandoned and junk vehicles to designated peace officers. So I think this will move pretty quickly, but I'll step back and remind ourselves why we even care about abandoned and junk vehicles. Partly, it's just a blight. This is things that bring down the character of the neighborhood, affect property values, diminish the community spirit and the pride of place. We have all sorts of vehicles around town. We estimate there are literally hundreds out there right now. The second, beyond just the eyesore value of it, is this guy, I hope, is not the person trying to sell their property, or maybe I hope they are the person trying to sell their property, rather. The other is a public safety concern. We end up with vehicles that have been abandoned in the right-of-way. They are often a magnet attracting some level of criminality. They tend to burst into flame after a while, which doesn't do anybody any good. We have traffic safety problems from vehicles who are in the right-of-way, things that are too close to signs, who are blocking visibility on traffic signals. This guy looks like he has taken up almost an entire lane of this road. I don't know what this person is doing right here. And that really impedes our snow removal operations. So we have our rogues gallery of bumped out streets that didn't get appropriately plowed because we had to work around cars. I particularly like the last one in this series where we just finally spray painted the snow, toe. So here's the story. Before 1997, to deal with the eyesores, the public safety concerns, the traffic concerns, and the snow plowing concerns, we had three different parts of the municipality that were on this issue: right-of-way enforcement, code enforcement, and the police department. Then a funny thing happened, and it is a story involving parking ferries. So here's a story from 2013 that reminds us, back in 1977, we had two sisters who roamed the streets wearing tutus, who revolted against the old parking enforcement scheme. Before 1997, the old parking authority for the municipality of Anchorage handled enforcement on city streets, and its officers were prolific ticket writers. They were doing all sorts of things: expired meters, cracked windshields, expired tags, broken taillights, studded tire violations, and even after the fact, the municipality agreed they were kind of going overboard, and the people were not so happy. So the public attention that was come from this over-enforcement led to a city ordinance. This is actually a charter amendment. Sean Dugan got that a little bit wrong. That allowed only police officers to issue tickets. So what happened was there was a citizen-led initiative to amend the charter, and in our city constitution, we now have this very detailed provision about who gets to enforce vehicle rules. And the way they accomplished it was in large measure by these first two sections, which I'll introduce you to. No enforcement of any vehicle violation, whether the vehicle is parked or in motion, may be performed in the municipality of Anchorage by persons other than regularly sworn police officers. And what are vehicle violations? They're any and all civil or criminal statutes, codes, ordinance, regulations which apply to the regulation of vehicles and which currently exist or may exist in the future. And then they went on to say, special rule for towing: no vehicle may be impounded, towed, or transported on the public streets unless an impound notice is placed on the vehicle by a police officer. So we lived with that. But it didn't really have anything to do with this car that's abandoned on this right-of-way somewhere in an industrial area. I think it was most acutely about downtown parking enforcement. But it took two of the main players out of the game. After 1997, we're down to just the police department. By 2011, that had proved to be more of a challenge. APD just didn't have the staff to really prioritize parking enforcement, especially downtown, which was the thing that started all of this. And so from 1997 to 2011, we were writing about 50 tickets a day. Businesses were upset downtown because everyone was just parking their car and not feeding the meter and no one was getting ticketed. They wanted more enforcement. So we went back to the voters and more or less gutted the whole reason for this provision to exist in the beginning. We created the Easy Park exception, which said in downtown, it can be someone other than a police department, it can be Easy Park. So that passed the voters, and now we have a new player involved post-2011. But we keep tinkering with it because what we did was when we were limited to officers of the police department, regularly sworn officers, we didn't want to take our crime-fighting, most highly paid sergeants, lieutenants, patrol officers. We asked our community service officers to do it, and they were doing it for a long time. We have 3 of them then. We still have 3 of them now. We've been doing it for 2 decades. But then the Alaska Police Standards Safety Council said, actually, the CSOs are not really sworn officers. So that threw a monkey wrench in. We went back to the voters in 2013, said we want to keep the CSOs on this game rather than the actual sworn police officers. The voters let us make that change too, so we can delegate to CSOs within the police department. And then more tinkering. Girdwood decided that they wanted some parking enforcement, but the charter said that it had to be the Anchorage Police Department, and Girdwood was retaining Whittier to do it, so we made a Whittier exception. So after the Citizens Initiative in 1997, we have made a whole lot of changes to the original proposal, and leaves us in this kind of configuration. We still have this car, and our pitch today is we want to put right-of-way and code enforcement back in the game for this car. What actually happens now is that right-of-way and code enforcement, which together have something like a dozen people who are out roving the town, dealing with code compliance issues, right-of-way issues, investigating stuff, will see abandoned and junk vehicles that are in the right-of-way that are causing problems, and they will leave a green tag on the car that says, please move this car, or the police department is going to come back in the form of a community service officer and put a white tag on the car. And that says, please move this car, or we're going to actually impound it. And this is a model of inefficiency. This is the kind of stuff that when citizens hear about, wait, Jack's people are putting a green tag that says if you don't do something, we're going to put a white tag, and then we're going to do something, just can't understand and really hate. So it's not efficient at all. The pitch is, let's get these guys back in the game. And why do we care about that? Not only is it a force multiplier, there are only 3 community service officers. There are something like 12 people in Jack's department who are already out running a street. Community service officers perform a bunch of functions. One of them is this vehicle removal function all the way from the Kinnick River all the way down to Kenai Peninsula. But they respond to parking complaints all over the municipality, in neighborhoods and trailheads and the state and city parks. When we have a big traffic incident, a crash on the roads, they will go in and start routing people around so that the patrol officers can go back to being real patrol officers instead of just traffic cops. When vehicles are in distress, people need to be rescued out of ditches, CSOs will do that. And they go pick up found property, bicycles, and wallets, all of which lets the sworn officers get back to the job. And having them running around town tagging vehicles that have already been tagged is not optimal and is a drain on the police department. And actually, we asked the union that question too because we wanted to make sure that if we put this change to voters, there wasn't going to be any objections from the union. And the response we got from the union was, I have seen firsthand the drain, both from a resource management side and a financial side, that the junk and abandoned vehicle enforcement has on our department. They're a public safety risk, they're an eyesore, and I think this is all a mistake. This was an unintended consequence to the original amendment in 1997. So they support the passage of the amendment. There is a very small chance that this could result in a very small amount of additional money to the municipality because in practice we are not very good at issuing fines and fees or penalties for people that have abandoned their vehicle because the CSOs just do not have time to sit down and write these citations. Code enforcement could also write the citations. Real life, there's probably no blood in that stone, and so it would just get rolled into the PFD garnishments. That's not the aim, but that is probably part of the story. Here's how we would do it. The charter amendment would go to voters in this form. Peace officer enforcement of laws related to abandoned and junk vehicles. Charter currently requires that enforcement of vehicle violations in Anchorage be performed only by regularly sworn officers of the Anchorage Police Department, with some specific exceptions. This proposition would permit the municipality to allow municipal peace officers to share with the police department the authority to enforce laws that include flagging and removal of vehicles, those that authorize the imposition of fine and recovery and storage and towing costs. The proposition would not permit peace officers to enforce laws related to vehicle violations other than those specifically related to abandoned and junk vehicles. We didn't want to blow the entire thing out and draw objections about photo radar or other things that people are worried about. Wanted to keep it pretty tight. I will say that in preparing this presentation, there's one amendment I will ask you guys to make, which is to remove regularly sworn from this part of the description, because the exception, one of the exceptions, is the CSO exception, which is the exception that really swallows the whole rule. So that's misleading if we don't delete that, so I'll ask you guys to delete that. And then it's a fairly simple charter amendment. We would say, vehicle violation enforcement, we can, if you approve by an ordinance only, delegate enforcement of ordinances related to abandoned and junk vehicles to municipal employees designated as peace officers, which is our usual way of doing animal control and a lot of code enforcement. Those would be Jack Frost's folks. And similarly, just as we made an exception for employees of other police departments, i.e. Whittier, to tow and remove vehicles from public streets, we would now say a designated peace officer can also perform that function. So that's the pitch, and if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them.
There are a couple, Mr. Trainee.
Mr. Palsy, what's the cost now to drop off a vehicle to have it destroyed?
We, through the police department, pay a towing contractor to do it.
Well, that's
I
my
don't
other
know.
question is, who's going to do the towing?
I think that at least presently, we would still rely on the APD towing contract. That's where the funds are programmed. I don't know if Chief Dahl or Deputy Chief McCoy knows what the per car.
I don't know off the top of my head what the actual per car dollar cost is. I can try to find out.
You find out for me.
Yeah, I want to say it's on the order of like.
We said in the memorandum that the costs are approximately $150 for a standard vehicle, $900 for a motorhome, and $300 for a vehicle that requires a special hook,
There you go.
which is a
That's
traffic hazard.
There's also a cost to have it destroyed. I mean, there's a cost to tow it, but then you got to tow it to some place that will destroy it. So my question is, are we going to pay for the towing and for the destruction of the vehicle?
Yep.
I think the answer to that, sir, is that we're already doing that as part of our junk vehicle contract, and the removal of the vehicle from the street covers all of that.
My other question relates to, we put a green tag on a car. The owner comes out, looks at it, moves the car 6 inches. How is this going to change that from happening? Because that happens all the time in Anchorage. You give them a ticket, green, they're going to move it 6 inches, and then you got to wait till you guys come back out again. Are you going to change the law to require them to move it 100 feet or something?
Right. So the answer to that question is the only thing that would be different is that there will be a white tag instead of a green tag, and it will be the only tag that is necessary, and then they could move their car 6 inches, and it might not make a difference. But that underscores what this narrow question for voters is. It's just, can we get Jack's 12 people in the game too? The rules about what an abandoned vehicle car is, what a junk car is, how we enforce that, that is not set by this, and if we want to revisit that, if you guys want to revisit that, we are open to all of those conversations. This is really about getting out of this really silly misallocation of resources.
Well, thank you. I'll support this because we've needed to have this for quite a while. Thank you, Bill.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Balsey. Sounds like a great idea. My question is, it seems like code enforcement is kind of pretty busy right now. We hear a lot from constituents that things aren't being enforced. So how, putting this burden on them, what's the plan for that?
One of my favorite things I ever heard Jack Frost say was during an earlier public safety committee meeting. They asked him how he's going. I believe he responded, too many resources, not enough work to do, which is actually the exact opposite of what is true. The answer is, this is not a panacea, but it does mean that the green tags are replaced with the white tags, and so the work that they are already doing now becomes meaningful instead of being silly. Once we get out there and we have a fuller crew, we will see if that makes a more rapid dent. I mean, eventually we might need to throw some additional resources at it, but really, this is part of recognition that those code enforcement officers are already out there, already doing this, but their work is not as meaningful as it should be, and it still causes more work for the 3 community service officers at APD that should be relieving the burden from sworn patrol officers.
Great, thank you.
Come back around to you, Mr. Dyson.
Thanks. I have a couple, 3 things in mind, but did I hear that you say that these 12 heroes that work for Jack are members of the police bargaining unit?
They are not members of the police bargaining unit.
I would guess that their cost is 60% or of what it costs to have a sworn officer doing these duties.
I will confess that I don't know, but I suspect Jack's code enforcement officers are cheaper than regular sworn police officers. So I'm getting head shakes
I
from...
don't know that answer.
But, and I don't need to know. My guess is it's significantly cheaper. Right away. We're going to get some pushback, and maybe some of the folks that don't want us putting people's abandoned tents and garbage cans, will come after us. What's that threat like, or is that a big deal? What has happened in other jurisdictions?
Through the chair, I'm not sure I perceive a large threat so long as we can convey to folks that all we're doing is allowing folks who are already out there who are doing a job to do the job more meaningfully, and that it releases police
right.
officers who are there. So
Right.
the zealousness of the enforcement, the character of the enforcement, that remains a question for all of you.
So, just the reality, Mr. Trainee, is that scrap steel has no value
Exactly, that's what my point is.
here. And my guess is when we start doing this much more efficiently, it'll be front-end loaded and the workload will go down when the word gets out and cars are getting hauled away and so on. So,
And through the chair, frankly, if we do have some glimmer of hope, which is probably false hope, that if we can really put some penalty on this action, if we can write some volley of tickets and word gets around that it is not costless to abandon your Craigslist vehicle in an old bus pullout, then maybe that will start to change behavior, but we'll see.
yeah.
Ms. Wimont?
Yeah, just 2 clarifications. This is on public property, correct? Or right-of-ways, and if we're not,
Not on private property.
So through the chair, I think the answer is actually no. So the thing that's motivating us is the public right-of-way. The charter is written in 2101A and 2101 and 2102. 2102 is specifically limited to public streets. 2101 says no vehicle enforcement anywhere where it's parked or in motion. So looking at Jack around the corner, I believe it is also the case that you are tied if someone is complaining that they have 20 junk vehicles in their front yard. Is that the case?
This wouldn't affect that at all. That's totally a land use violation, a land violation is investigated.
Okay, so maybe I was wrong. Maybe the answer is yes, this is really a public right-of-way story.
Which can include public use and that type of situation.
Okay, the peanut gallery has made me smarter. The answer is actually yes. This is
Okay,
public
so
right-of-way.
this doesn't
And
affect it, but just on your point, then what is the ability of the municipality to take away junk cars on private property?
We have to go through the administrative hearing process, prove this a violation, and give an order to remove from the property by the administrative hearing officer.
I'll come back to you. You brought that up. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Due process steps there, but that's totally separate from enforcing in the right of way.
And I'm sorry, now this is all coming back to me. That's right. Because what you're doing there is not removing abandoned and junk property. You're saying that you are operating an illegal junkyard, which is not permitted by the zoning, and so that already goes through the zoning.
As the scenario was described with multiple junk vehicles, yes, that's correct.
Ms. Wimont?
yeah, and then 2 other clarifications. One, is there any recourse if, let's say, the tag says it's supposed to be taken February 1st, and the tow company gets ahead of schedule and takes it January 31st? Is there recourse?
So the way that works, if the vehicle is abandoned for 72 hours, it's towed and it's taken to a tow yard, and the owner receives a letter allowing them 20 days to contact them to make arrangements to receive the vehicle back, or if that 20 days elapses, then it moves forward to the scrap.
Well, and I understand that. Thank you for that. What I am looking for is the actual tow paper that's put on the car that says if you don't move your car in 72 hours, this is what's going to happen. but the tow company picks it up a day early. Okay, maybe the person says, okay, I'm gonna get my buddy out here with their pickup truck and we're gonna pull my car home, but we go there on the day before it was due and it's gone because someone's a little overzealous. Who would someone contact for that? Or a constituent, I'm asking this, and then I want the last clarification.
Somebody would contact the police department, and then if we found that to be true, that's an issue we'd have to address with the contractor.
And there would be no cost to that person?
It just depends on the circumstances. Answering a question like that in broad general terms would be extremely difficult.
Okay.
Each one of these things would be evaluated on the actual individual circumstances that were applicable, and then we'd look to see if the contractor made a mistake or if one of our people made a mistake, and then we
Okay,
address it.
thank you. And then the last, thank you very much for
Yeah.
that clear answer. The last thing is, I would make a suggestion that we not go from green to white, we go from white to green. Because in the winter, I think a bright green tag will show up much better than a white tag. And so I would urge you, in your tagging situation, to perhaps use bright colors as your own color.
There we
Great
go.
point.
And
I like it.
that was the chief of police, but everybody announce who you are for the record, so we have a nice clean audio recording.
That was Gretchen Wemhoff just speaking.
Yeah. Mr. Trainer.
Eric, a few years ago, when Lystrom was mayor, we had something called rusted keys. We actually went into people's yards. If the car was not registered, we towed it. A lot of people in Anchorage wanted that to happen, and it was not that popular because a lot of people have extra vehicles in the yard.
Yeah, and Spinard, it's
So,
decoration.
across this town, so it did not work out too well. Got rid of a lot of cars. We had a huge backflow from the public. That car is my property. I don't need to register it. You can't take it away. So, just some history for you.
Good cautionary note.
Ready to hand off?
Was there other comments from assembly members, questions? Any from the telephonic ones? Yeah.
This is Christopher. Just that I think that this is a really wise move for us to adopt, and hopefully the voters will agree. And I think even my friends, the parking ferries, would be okay with this because what we're seeing is pendulum is far swung the other way, where cars could sit for days and weeks and months, and there isn't recourse because of the lack of resources. So this is a wise use of the municipal resources, and I urge everyone to support it.
Anything, Mr. Weddleton?
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, what do we use the red tags on vehicles for? Then, I thought that we would put red tags on vehicles if they were supposed to be towed. So, that's not true?
Sure. The red tags are used for vehicles that are parked over 24 hours, and so those are removed out of the roadway, and those aren't taken for destruction. Those are impounded for safekeeping, and the owners notified. So these are for abandoned vehicles.
All right, thanks.
That was Deputy Chief McCoy. Ms. Wynn Pearson?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, we were having a sidebar here about Mr. Hoff's question about appeal rights. If your vehicle, if you believe your vehicle is towed too early, we had a question that we talked about earlier this week that was exactly that question from an individual. And there's also an appeal right to the administrative hearing officer of that citation, and you can go and say, so if you've gone to APD and said, my car was towed too early, and they say, no, we think it was towed at the right time, you can also go to the administrative hearing officer and have an actual hearing on whether or not your car was towed justly before anything happened.
That is, I'm sorry, through the chair, that is located where?
On the 7th floor of City Hall.
Okay, thank you.
Is that all your questions? Yeah?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I agree with this. I just wanted to make sure I understood it.
Yeah, of course.
And I like bright colors.
Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, so both the parking ferries were pretty good friends and delightful ones. And as I remember, what they were after is whoever was writing the tickets, almost standing beside a meter waiting for it to click so they could put the tickets on. And these delightful ladies would skip down the street just ahead of that person plugging the meters and so on. And it wasn't the abandoned vehicles on stuff, it was the overzealous enforcement, in the downtown area. And I may be wrong with that, but in one sense, it was a delightful citizens' revolt against some a real world problem that was a problem for downtown parkers and building, or businesses and stuff a bit. Anyways, I enjoyed it. I'm sorry it had such bad consequences.
It probably had a cleansing consequence, at least initially, but now.
Mr. Trainee.
Fred, it wasn't just there. It was, they would go to garage sales, their cars parked. They would look for any violation of the car, expired plates, anything else, and give you a ticket. They would go to the bazaars around town, and they would give you tickets there for expired plates or anything else they could give a ticket for. It wasn't just
Yeah, okay.
parking meters, it was across the board.
Was there an economic incentive for them to be so zealous?
We don't know what it was. We got a lot of blames for a lot of areas, so.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I didn't mean to divert us.
I think a lot of those people moved out of Anchorage, so hopefully this will get by the voters.
Ms.
We need
Lemon?
to do it.
Yeah,
Ms. Lemon?
I want to add to that. They would go to school parking lots and ticket teachers when their tags were one day over. People were having their credit reports messed with because each of the tickets, if they weren't paid, they were going on to credit. So it was a big deal. And I'm finished.
Let us all be in favor of ferries.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I have to full-heartedly agree with Mr. Dyson on that last point.
On supporting ferries?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that one. And also, I think that all of these points I'm bringing up are just cautionary tales going forward for our team should this pass. That history could repeat itself, and we don't want to do that.
Mr. Dyson and Mr. Constant are in support of ferries. Any other discussion? We're about midway through, and we want to give equal time to the less interesting ordinance. Pretend that we're as interested. Good. So let's switch over. Do you have a PowerPoint presentation, Ms. Member? Do you? Oh, I was doing that all thinking you wouldn't.
I mean, probably not, but I do.
Mr. Chair,
There's
I want to
no
refer to the contact, and not the presenter.
Not the presenter. It was the content. In fact, they had to have a much more interesting presenter because the content was so
Well, you're
poor.
going to dig yourself in a hole here.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I think that we set Ms. Wynn Pearson up by making her follow the senator.
Yeah.
I know that what you're really saying is that you're so excited about lease purchase agreements. This is the highlight of the afternoon.
Not.
This is as good as it gets.
Yeah.
Basically,
Oh my God.
the most exciting thing that's happened all week. I did prepare a PowerPoint in an attempt to spice things up a little, but I will concede that this may be the less interesting part of this afternoon. So I'm here to talk about 2019-10, the lease purchase agreement charter amendment. As an initial moment of background, this is a refresher, what is a lease purchase agreement? It is a lease that contains a purchase option, so which generally includes the application of some amount of the rent that you have paid over the years toward the purchase price when you exercise the purchase option. So right now we have language in our charter in 1308 that talks about lease purchase agreements, says we can only enter into them for a capital improvement in excess of $1 million if the lease purchase agreement is approved by the majority of the qualified voters voting on the question. So what does this practically mean? What does this
Was that
practically mean?
original from the original charter, or is it added later?
Yeah, that is original.
Okay.
And my understanding, so what does this mean practically? It means something like City Hall, for which we have a long-term lease. We could not turn that into a lease purchase agreement unless we went to the voters with the question of whether or not we wanted to have that agreement in place because the building is worth more than $1 million. And so why is this in the charter? Why is this an issue at all? Why do we have something as specific as lease purchase agreements drafted into our municipal constitution? It is because our Alaska State Constitution makes clear that debt cannot be entered into unless authorized for capital improvements by a municipal governing body and ratified by the voters. And the concern was a lease purchase agreement looks an awful lot like debt. It basically looks like a financing instrument in a way, a workaround, as you might, of this debt restriction if you could do this without the authorization of the voters. But in 1985, we have the leading case interpreting this provision of the Constitution, or interpreting the parallel provision that applies to state debt, which specifically considered lease purchase agreements and which held that where a lease purchase agreement does not require annual appropriation, so where it specifically by its terms says this agreement is subject to annual appropriation, the agreement is not debt, so it's not covered by the constitutional restriction. It is permissible. So what we've ended up with is a provision in our charter which is sort of simultaneously over-restrictive and under-restrictive, because it says everything in excess of $1 million has to go to the voters, which again, this Kargatstein case says, no, it doesn't have to go to the voters. If it's subject to annual appropriation, it's something that the Assembly has the power to do without going to the voters for ratification. But we also have this weird $1 million threshold in our charter, and I say weird because I couldn't figure out where it came from. I can find a clear train for why we put that number in there. That number does not correspond to anything in the Constitution. It doesn't correspond to anything in case law. It seems like it was just a threshold we threw in there, which again, reading the Kargatstein case, Kargatstein implies that any lease purchase agreement, even for a $100,000 property, would be required to have this appropriation clause in it in order to pass constitutional muster. And there's nothing magic about that $1 million number. But the Kargatstein case also holds that lease purchase agreements for an asset in excess of $1 million don't need to have a vote of the people. They just need to have a clause in the lease that specifies that they're subject to future appropriation. So what are we proposing? We're basically proposing send a question to the voters of whether we can align current charter language with the current case law interpretation of the Constitution. So yeah, we've added the caveat that payments under a lease purchase agreement must be subject to annual appropriation, again, as specified in that Kargatstein case. Taken out this $1 million, relatively arbitrary $1 million threshold. The first piece, I think, is actually necessary to align the charter with current case law. The second piece is discretionary. We could certainly be more restrictive than case law if we want to. In our charter, we could say no, even though we're not required to go to the voters, we would still like to go to the voters. But taking this out gives us the flexibility that we are permitted under state law, and which would allow this body to work with the administration to build these kinds of agreements into some of our long-term lease agreements, which I think would have the practical benefit of helping with buildings, again, like City Hall. If we could have had a purchase option at the end of our lease, we've spent an awful lot of money on this lease. And so if some of that could have been credited toward an eventual purchase, that might have been a financially advantageous position for the city. We've also had this discussion with respect to 716 West 4th. If this charter change is adopted by the voters, a lease purchase agreement between APD and ACDA would be a possibility for APD to eventually have some of their rent credited against a potential eventual purchase of that building by the city through APD. I understand there was also a smart light scheme several years ago that was thwarted by this provision of the charter. I don't know all the details there, so I can't tell the specifics of what was about. Someone on the body might remember better than I do. But there have been, again, several things over the years where the ability to enter into a lease purchase agreement would have been beneficial and would have needed to happen on a timeline that wouldn't allow going to a vote of the people before executing the document. And so this change would allow this body the flexibility to make those kinds of judgment calls in the future, as long as the documents themselves said this agreement is subject to appropriation by the Assembly each year.
I'm confused by that. There may be other questions, but the municipality can sign clearly very large binding leases, not lease purchase, but we can say, we're gonna, for 20 years, pay you $1 million a year for this thing. And that's I guess a form of debt. If we reneged upon it, whoever could sue us and get their payments or damages for, and we don't need any voter approval if it's a pure lease. Right?
That is true. You need the charter and the code specify that you can, by ordinance, approve a contract that binds future assemblies to appropriate the funds to pay that contract. The division is when the purchase element comes in, because the question when there's a purchase at the end of it, is it really a loan for a capital asset as opposed to a contract for lease of the space? And so that's why that was built into the charter. And again, it was, I mean, the Carr-Gottstein Court in 1995 had to consider that specific question. If it's a lease purchase agreement, is it really debt or not under the Constitution as the Constitution framed that question? And they determined it was not.
Got it. And then, so what the language we're adding though, it's subject to appropriate. Does that mean I get to violate the lease purchase because we 1 year say we're not doing the payment? And do you get out of it, or is it just sort of magic words where we know we're going to comply with our obligations? We don't want to be sued. So what is really adding subject to appropriation do contractually?
Contractually, it would mean that you would need to, in order to use this provision, so to enter into a lease purchase agreement without going to the voters, the contract itself, the lease purchase agreement would have to include a provision that says subject to annual appropriation by the Assembly as part of the contract, which would effectively give the municipality an out under the contract if the funds were not appropriated in a future year.
Mr. Chair?
Comment, Mr. Trainee, and then you, Mr. Constant.
Rebecca, the thing is, we cannot bind future assemblies. So that's the reason we've got that phrase in there. Because we could have another assembly meeting 2 years and they say, we need the money for something else, like the court or something. We're not going to appropriate this money. So we can bind future assemblies. That's why it's in there. Like the state can do, can't bind future legislation. So we've got that in there because of that restriction.
There you go. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. So, Becky, help me understand then, is this fairly the same scenario under which the state entered into the building formerly known as the LIO?
I'm sorry, so you're saying, is this what the state did to enter into that agreement?
Right.
That's a good question. It's a little bit more complicated. The state had an existing lease for the LIO, or this property at 716 West 4th Avenue, which they amended to add in a build-to-suit component, and I believe also an eventual purchase at the end. I'm honestly, I haven't read the document, so I'm not sure. That was a complex document, and that one of the part that was litigated about was whether it was a new document or in fact an amendment to an existing lease agreement. I'm not sure exactly what their purchase option looked like in that document.
So kind of the rub of the question after the technical questions are resolved is, are we getting ourselves in a position where we could get over our heads and then find ourselves, running through courts to figure out how we finish the deal?
I don't think that's a great analogy, because the real challenge, the real issue that was litigated in the state deal was whether or not the appropriate approval was obtained for a new lease agreement, whether or not they went through the right, I believe, competitive process in order to issue a lease for a new legislative office building. It was not a question of whether or not the document itself comported with constitutional debt restrictions. There they were dealing entirely with public process around selection of the building, and the thing that was questioned was whether amending an existing lease, like whether it was really truly an amendment, because it involved sweeping in a neighboring property and also the construction of an entirely new building. So I think that's an inopposite comparison.
Thanks. So it's just not a good comparison. Thank you.
Other assembly questions or comments? Yeah, Ms. Slivka.
So I could offer the comment that in my prior life, we routinely signed contracts with state entities that were the clause subject to annual appropriation. It was very.
And I'll say, just sort of boil it all down, what is this all about? I think this amendment, and Becky will kick me under the table if I'm getting this wrong, is really to say, if you want to bind a future assembly, the only power that can do that is a vote of the people. As long as you retain discretion in future assemblies, then we should be able to do whatever kind of financing mechanism we want to do. But what we have now is this goofy charter provision that has done things like make us pay rent for City Hall 3 times over when we could have just bought it, and also gives us an apparent invitation to create real debt so long as it's less than $1 million, which is not legal. So it's a cleanup, and it underscores that the only people that can create real debt in bind future assembly is the people, and otherwise, as long as discretion is retained, you can do whatever financing mechanism makes sense.
Even $500,000 of real debt ought to be a vote of the people.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, the $1 million threshold. I don't know where that came from, because it doesn't comport with Constitution or with with any kind of case law that's interpreted the Constitution. So,
Ms. Quinn David.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I was going to ask whether practically anyone wants to enter into an agreement subjecting it to annual appropriation, because it seems like that's a little risky, but Alex is saying people do that all the time, so I guess that answers that question. The second piece was with the LAO building, or whatever we call it now. What do we call it?
716 Westport.
The police
I
headquarters.
feel like we need a better,
Yes.
So at police headquarters, so we already have a lease agreement there, so we would potentially modify the lease agreement to enter into a potential.
This would open that door. I know when we went through that process, there were many members of this body who were interested in the question of whether APD might eventually acquire that building if it was useful. And we talked about some of the practical hurdles of doing that, given the restrictions on how the municipality incurs debt. Practically speaking, if this is adopted by the voters, APD and ACDA could, if they were so inclined, renegotiate their lease document to include a purchase option.
Mr. Dice.
Yeah. Who is liable to push back against this? It seems just such common sense to me, but.
Honestly, I think the biggest challenge for this charter change is confusion and lack of understanding, because it's hard to understand why this matters. Why is this in here to begin with? So perhaps people might be triggered by the fact that it does remove an automatic vote of the people for certain agreements, and it moves that discretion to the assembly. That's the only objection I can think of. It really, and again, this really does aligns our charter with the existing case law, and no-brainer.
Mr. Croft and I have had spirited discussions over nearly a quarter of a century about whose end of the political spectrum has got the most reactionary nutcakes.
You win, Fred.
I decline to comment on that.
Our definition of reactionary is
Some suspicious people say, some public officials got buddies that got a deal they're cooking, and this makes it happen without people getting after it. But Ms. Quinn Davison, you raise an interesting question, and it's a classic one under our constitutions. Is the legislature always having the next one be able to say, I don't like that deal, I'm not going to pay. Ask the oil industry in Alaska if they should trust the Alaska legislature to live up to the deals they made in good faith. And in the last, 3 years, nationally, we've seen cities go broke. And I think Eric or Ms. Davison or Wendy, I think that the one contracts that a sovereign cannot duck are like labor contracts and retirement benefits and all that kind of thing. Have I got that right?
Yes, I believe so. Honestly,
There's a state constitutional provision that says retirement benefits cannot be diminished.
Yeah.
And then similarly, the general obligation bonds.
Yeah, and so a couple of cities are literally selling the museum and a whole lot of other assets because the court said you can't duck that one. So it's not just private contract.
It'll be interesting to see whether the legislative basically default on the LIO change it. I mean, we've seen a lot of these contracts, but it's because the governmental entities, at least up here, haven't been default. We've always been doing the appropriations that promise. It'll be interesting whether that example means people are less interested in subject to appropriation contracts or lease purchases.
Yeah, although again, I would, and you may have additional insight into this that I don't have. My involvement in that previous deal was in a private practice capacity with the developer. I would shy away from too many comparisons to the state's deal because the issue there was really about whether it was a lease extension or a new lease. It wasn't really about the appropriations issue. Chris is looking at me a little bit puzzled in the back. I don't know if you have anything to say, but I think it's not an apples to apples comparison. The appropriations clause that we would propose in these kinds of agreements and that specific deal.
Okay, further questions, comments? Distractions. That was fascinating. Thank you.
Anytime.
Very interesting.
That's what I said, yeah.
I feel like I'm getting
Dare I
pity
say,
compliments,
or
but I
interesting, then.
appreciate it.
PowerPoint was great, Rebecca.
Fabulous. Set a new standard for PowerPoint here at work sessions. Any other member comments on either of the two ordinances? When we have, there, Ms. Rumhoff,
I
sorry.
would like to repeat that bright colors draw attention for everyone. Okay?
We want your lease purchase agreements in
No,
bright
All of our
colors.
lease purchase
I
agreements
believe
will be orange.
Well,
How about the LIO?
Well, I believe that the more we allow officers to see something's already been tagged, so they don't have to approach it again, and for people to see it, I just say bright, bright, bright.
Sold.
Okay, thank you.
We are not required to do so, though Mr. Haber and I debate that back and forth, but when we have time, we'll allow public testimony in a work session. Yeah.
Just administration, I'd like something there that delineates how far you've got to move your car. Because I've seen people move it literally inches ahead. They put a mark on where it's at, they move it a few inches ahead. So I don't know whether you guys require them to move 50 feet or something, but they should be able not to go out and move it just
But that,
2 inches.
And I'll say
that's something we do by
Yeah, you
ordinance,
guys can do
right?
that.
But that is under works. Daryl has his pulling together a working group, and there are going to be some proposed amendments. But again, that has nothing to do with this.
Thank you.
He wants that. When you have the authority, then we'll look back into what the standards are there. Any public comment on either one of these ordinances? Mr. Haberman. 3 minutes, sir.
My name is Eugene Cohen, I live in Madison Valley. I follow the public process. The public process done appropriately. Decision made by the governing body. It's no longer the public interest. First note, both presentations was here at this meeting. It would have been more appropriate if it was a written document presentation, copies, instead of having on the screen. Particularly note that this meeting is audio. It's not video audio. And the public is blinded if they ever listen to the audio to the particular documents. And the last point I'll say is this, I've said before, these meetings you have down here, with all due respect, are very informative, but you're keeping the public not connected with what you're doing. And frequently you have these meetings, issues that you are taking as public hearings before the public and through said library. But the fact is, this information is the public's being blinded as far as being connected with what you're saying here. And yes, there's an audio tape, but frequently you have a situation that has not been recognized. But also note, I witnessed even the APT in the back of the room speaking, but there's been a note for the record frequently from Arthur Joseph's clerk that they need to be up front because of difficulty of hearing. And there were several people in the back of the room speaking, including attorney, was from the back of the room, and we need to have it brought closer to the mic so we can connect it. So again, in closing, I just encourage you to move these meetings to the SAC library and have it the video audio and connect with people more appropriately. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Haberman. Any other public comment or public testimony comment? Ms. Wimhoff.
Oh, I just wanted to comment, I do think that the ability to hear the sound is an issue. I've tried to listen to get caught up, and sometimes it's very difficult to hear even the people who are speaking for the visual aids. I think that's a good point, and I do also think that it's a good point that if we're keeping a record, that some of these charts, the visuals have been really nice. I think it'd be very useful. Most of them are put up, but I did want to say I have witnessed not being able to hear on the audio.
Okay. Seeing no other comments, this is adjourned.